May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Please be seated. So through that ongoing presence of COVID in our midst, you can see I am not my dear friend and seminary classmate, Olga Hartwell. And I am really sorry about that because Olga's sermon this week was awesome. And so we decided together that I would deliver Olga's sermon for her. So Olga, please give me strength, Lord, to do the job Olga would do. Let me start just with a little bit of a conversation, though. Part of the reason why we thought this would be important today. First of all, who is listening carefully to the Hebrew Bible reading, the Old Testament reading that Ed read so beautifully? How many camels were in that reading? You see where I'm going already, right? So obviously a camel is a tremendous beast of burden, carrying loads of meaning and metaphor. And when God puts a lot of camels in our head, you can be sure there is a message for us in them. The more camels there are in a message, the more packed it is, and the longer the distance and difficulty of the travails that got the message to us. And as you know, sermons are also, we've said many times, our ongoing conversation, ours, this community's conversation about Scripture in our midst. What is the context? What is the meaning? Who are we? And who is God meaning for us to be in this context and in this moment? And so today's sermon, like Maggie Dong's beautiful sermon last week on the near sacrifice by Abraham of Isaac, when Abraham believed God had asked him to do that awful thing, when Maggie, raised up the meaning and the sanctity of every human life and every human agency and every one's specific context. And this is the time last year when we were getting ready, I was getting ready to go off to the Lambeth Conference of Bishops. And we talked about difference and maintaining our curiosity, maintaining our presence, and maintaining our creativity for how we work in difference. So Olga wanted to start this morning with a nomination for the very best first line in all of literature. First line of a novel, ever, she says. Here it is. "Take my camel, dear," said my Aunt Dot, climbing down from that animal on her return from High Mass. Yes, you heard it correctly. We'll do it again. "Take my camel, dear," said my Aunt Dot, climbing down from that animal on her return from High Mass. This is the opening of the Towers of Trebizond, which Olga sent me about a month ago, and I've been exclaiming over, and we've been reading and talking about. It's by Rose Macaulay, and it's simply brilliant. 20 well-chosen words, and your mind is off to the races, doing one of its favorite activities, figuring people out. Who is this proper, religious maiden aunt, English lady, and why is she riding a camel to church? And who is the deer who is taking the camel, the deer who presumably knows what to do with one of these fine animals after it's been cooling its heels in the parking lot for an hour at the church? You may be curled up in your coziest reading chair, but your mind is in happy overdrive. It's picking up signals, interpreting signs, figuring out who these characters are, what they're up to and why, and whether you want to spend more time with them. In fact, your mind is doing exactly what it does when it encounters real people in real life. We collect up observable data, and then we turn it over, examine it, fit it together in order to get at something that we can't perceive directly, the insides of other people's heads. We're social creatures, so our capacity to read other minds this way is an essential skill for survival. Unfortunately, we like doing it. One of the greatest pleasures of fiction is that it engages us in exactly this process. without the risks and pitfalls that arise when we read other minds in real life. See, we don't have to worry that Aunt Dot, who sounds like she might be a little nutty, will take one look at us, hop back on her camel, and run us over. When you're dealing with actual humans, on the other hand, it can be pretty important to get that mind reading part right. Consider Abraham's servant, arriving in a foreign land, hundreds of miles from home, with the mission to bring back a bride for Abram's son. That sounds like a terrible assignment. Difficult, high stakes, huge downside. Things probably won't go well if he brings back a bride that Isaac or Abraham don't like. But how is he going to choose? The inner workings are opaque to him. Is she kind, patient, industrious, open-minded? In an unfamiliar country with people he doesn't know, how on earth is he going to figure any of this out? Abraham's servant solves this conundrum by asking God for a set of observable signs, things he can see that will serve as confirmation he's made the right choice. "O Lord," he says, "I am standing here by the spring of water, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. Let the young people to whom I shall say, 'Please offer your jar that I may drink,' and who shall say, 'Drink, and I will water your camels.' Let her be the one whom you have appointed for Isaac." He's a smart man, Abraham's servant. This isn't one of those silly signs like the first person who comes out of the city gate that often end in disaster. The servant leaves room for his own initiative. He gets to choose the woman he asks for a drink. And the events that he's outlined, the woman not only gives him a drink, but volunteers to water his camels, are solid indicators that she's helpful, hospitable, friendly, and open of heart. Such a good plan. It almost makes you think it just takes a little thought and energy, this figuring people out. Almost, but not quite. Because do you know how much water a camel drinks at one sitting? Anybody? 30 gallons. Yes. It's true that a camel can go a week or more without a drink. But when it tanks up, 30 gallons, and it takes about 15 minutes. 30 gallons down the hatch. And do you remember how many camels Abraham's servant brought on this trip? 10. 10 camels, 30 gallons each. You do the math. "So I drank," Abraham's servant reports afterwards to Rebekah's brother Laban, "and she also watered the camels." In other words, he's telling Rebekah's brother that he stood around in the shade, having a nice drink of water, while Rebekah toted her 5-gallon water jug on her shoulder back and forth in the hot sun, say, 60 times? Who knows what a gallon of water weighs? I kept aquariums when I was a kid, so I learned to certify with my mother that I wasn't going through the floor with one of my aquariums by learning the rough rule that an aquarium water weighs about 8 pounds a gallon. 5 gallons of water, 8 pounds. That's 40 pounds on her shoulder 60 times. At this point, Laban probably should have punched Abraham's servant, not given him dinner. Not to mention that Laban may have wondered why the servant standing by the spring couldn't have gotten his own drink. Surely he remembered to pack a cup among those 10 camels. And it turns out that this story isn't about Abraham's servant coming up with a clever way to discern Rebekah's friendliness, hospitality, or work ethic. And it's not about his successful effort to read another person's mind. It's about divine intervention. How do I know that? I know it because divine intervention is what it would take for one young woman equipped with a single jug to water 10 thirsty camels while their owner had a cool drink. Laban, hearing the story from his sister, would have recognized the hand of God. And that's why he ran down to the spring to invite Abraham's servant and his 10 camels to stay at his house. Abraham's servant was smart, and not just in the way you think. He was smart enough to realize that he was way out of his depth. If he'd wandered in among strangers and relied on his own perceptions and intuitions to choose a bride for Isaac, he easily could have ended up taking the town's prime troublemaker back to his master's house. Yes, figuring out what other people are up to is an important skill, but we aren't actually that good at it. And it doesn't take much to scramble the signals. Abraham's servant was smart enough and humble enough to know his own limits and to seek God's help. But most of us tend to be overly confident in our ability to know what's going on in other people's heads. We read the tea leaves, interpret the signs, deploy our spidey sense, and then we're pretty sure we know what's what. Kind of like the children Jesus mentions in our reading from Matthew's gospel, the children sitting in the marketplace. See those people over there, we might say? We played the flute for them, and they didn't dance. Unbelievable. There we were, playing the flute, trying to be friendly, trying to lighten things up, and they just sat there, staring at us like we had 3 heads. So rude. They have a terrible attitude. Often our interpretations are incorrect. For all we know, the grumpy, non-dancing people may be the employees of a company that's just announced it's closing its local plant. But we take in the signs and interpret them and draw conclusions and forget our inferences may be completely wrong. Just like Jesus' crowd. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. These errors matter. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum, writing about Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, points out that the problem of other minds isn't simply an epistemological problem. That's a problem of evidence and certainty. It's an ethical one, produced by the motives and desires with which we approach other people. When we blithely misread people, forgetting their fundamental separateness, disregarding their own independent, mysterious center of being, we aren't just making a mistake of fact. The mistake is a moral one, and the injury real. Even when you aren't disparaging John the Baptist or the Son of God. What to do? Nussbaum draws evidence from the portrait of the long-married couple at the center of Woolf's novel. The Ramsays' mutual understanding is deeper, Nussbaum suggests, because they approach one another in humility and reverence. Their efforts to understand one another are grounded in love, trust, and mutual need. They recognize the limits on their understanding of each other's minds, and they respect each other's separate and at some level unknowable inner lives. Take my camel, dear, said my Aunt Dot, climbing down from that animal on her return from High Mass. Of course, we'll all go on trying to make sense of each other, trying to figure out who's who, what's what, and what it all means to us. As far as Aunt Dot is concerned, we can go for it. We can speculate, ruminate, extrapolate, We can let our minds roam wide and free. But when we turn our attention to an actual human being, let's follow the excellent example of Abraham's servant, bearing in mind our limitations and seeking God's help. Let's learn from Jesus, who is humble and gentle in heart, and be aware that our intuitions about other people are guesses, not facts. And let's remember what we do know for sure, that every single person is a beloved child of God. Amen.